Good evening, friends. If you enjoy calm history, told without hurry, stories that unfold slowly, like candlelight in a dark room, then stay a while. Put your phone face down, lower the volume, and let the noise outside fade. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. Tonight, we'll travel quietly through one of the most misunderstood chapters of modern history, the story of the Freemasons. For centuries, their name has carried a strange echo. Some hear it and imagine secret chambers filled with symbols, hidden handshakes, and world-shaping conspiracies. Others picture ordinary men in suits gathering once a month to eat, drink, and discuss charity work. The truth, as always, lies somewhere between fascination and misunderstanding. The word Mason once meant something simple, a builder, a worker of stone. But somewhere along the way, that craft turned into myth. How did a fraternity of medieval builders become, in the public imagination, a secret government that rules the world from the shadows? Why do their compasses and eyes still appear on banknotes, novels, and internet forums? And what keeps the myth alive long after the secrets themselves have lost their power? Our story begins not in darkness, but in daylight, on an ordinary afternoon in Moscow, more than 2 centuries ago. In the park of Kolomenskoye, there once stood a strange little house. It was wooden, weathered, covered with curious carvings that looked almost like code. According to local legend, it had been brought from France by a mysterious traveler, a man who called himself a Mason. He said he came to study Russian craftsmanship, but the villagers whispered that he came to teach the Tsar how to control the world. No one ever proved anything, of course. When the man died, people searched his belongings and found nothing but geometry tools, a Bible, and a sketch of Solomon's temple. The house still stood for decades, and people continued to argue. Was he a spy, a prophet, or just an eccentric architect? That question of meaning hidden in plain sight has followed Freemasonry everywhere it went. The fascination begins with secrecy itself. Human beings have always been drawn to what they are told not to see. Every locked door creates imagination. Every symbol invites interpretation. Freemasonry mastered that instinct. Its rituals were private, but not sinister. Its meetings were discreet, but not forbidden. Yet, because it hid its workings, people filled the silence with stories of power, of danger, of control. And those stories often said more about society's fears than about the Masons themselves. When rumors grow, they often echo the times that create them. In the 18th century, when monarchies feared revolution, Freemasonry was called a plot to destroy thrones. In the 19th, when nationalism rose, it was accused of being a foreign brotherhood. In the 20th, when totalitarian regimes needed enemies, it was painted as part of a global conspiracy. And even today, in an age of algorithms and endless information, the myth endures. Because secrecy feels ancient, and the idea of hidden order feels strangely comforting. Yet, the real Freemasonry began from something entirely human, the pride of craftsmen. Before it was mystery, it was labor. Before it was philosophy, it was skill. The word brotherhood once meant the literal bond between builders who shaped cathedrals out of stone. Their tools, the square, the compass, the plumb line, were not metaphors at first. They were instruments of precision. But as generations passed, those same tools became symbols of moral balance and spiritual architecture. To build a cathedral was one thing, to build a conscience another. Freemasonry turned the art of construction inward, teaching that every person is a kind of unfinished building, shaped by discipline and light. That shift, from stone to spirit, is what gave rise to legend. Because the moment a craft begins to speak about light, order, and hidden wisdom, it stops being only a trade. It becomes a story. And stories travel farther than buildings ever can. So, as we begin this exploration, it's important to set aside both extremes. Freemasonry is neither a puppet master government nor an innocent club of hobbyists untouched by history. It is a mirror, one that reflects whatever each age fears or desires. In its symbols, people see either tyranny or enlightenment, depending on the light they choose to hold it under. Throughout this episode, we'll walk carefully through those mirrors, from medieval guilds to the salons of Enlightenment Europe, from Russian lodges under Catherine the Great to the fevered dreams of conspiracy that followed. We'll meet men who sought moral improvement and others who sought power. We'll read their legends of Solomon's Temple and see how a myth of architecture turned into a map of human aspiration. And we'll ask a question that matters more today than ever. Why do people still believe in hidden orders? Because perhaps the fascination isn't really about the Masons themselves. Perhaps it's about us, about the longing for structure in a chaotic world, for meaning beneath coincidence, for proof that someone, somewhere, understands the plan. To believe in conspiracies is to believe in control. And that belief, even when wrong, is easier than admitting that no one is steering the ship. Freemasonry has survived monarchs, revolutions, dictatorships, and internet rumors. Its secrets are less about power than about continuity, the quiet comfort of ritual, the geometry of belonging. If there is a mystery left, it isn't what they do in their lodges. It's why the rest of us still care so deeply. So let's begin slowly, with open eyes and calm minds. Let's separate myth from memory, symbol from superstition. Because the story of the Freemasons isn't just about secret rooms and ancient codes. It's about how human beings, again and again, build invisible cathedrals out of faith, fear, and imagination. To understand Freemasonry, we have to start with its paradox. Ask 10 people what it is, and you'll get 10 different answers. To some, it's a harmless club for polite men who wear aprons and hold toasts. To others, it's the invisible hand that shapes governments, revolutions, and even world wars. The truth, as always, is less theatrical, but far more revealing. Freemasonry has always lived between two images, the public and the hidden. The public one is ordinary, a charitable fraternity that funds hospitals, scholarships, and disaster relief. In London, New York, or Paris, you can find lodges that list their addresses openly. Members meet for dinner, plan charity drives, and sometimes argue about bylaws. Their meetings end with laughter, not lightning. To anyone who's visited, it feels closer to a service club than a secret society. And yet, beyond those open doors, there lingers an aura of mystery. Because Masons, even now, keep certain rituals private. They guard symbols, passwords, and gestures, relics of medieval guild customs. They speak of light, truth, and brotherhood with deliberate formality. The secrecy seems harmless, even quaint, but it awakens something deep in the collective imagination. The moment a door is locked, people assume something forbidden lies behind it. That tension, openness and secrecy, benevolence and suspicion, has followed Freemasonry for 3 centuries. It makes them both admired and feared. When a Mason tells you their fraternity is about self-improvement, you might believe it. But when you see presidents, scientists, generals, and artists among its ranks, you might also wonder, is it only about self-improvement? It's easy to see why suspicion grows. Throughout history, the Masonic network has been vast, connected across borders, yet not beholden to any government. It values loyalty to its members over loyalty to party or nation. That independence has always seemed strange to rulers. In monarchies, they were accused of republicanism. In republics, of royalism. In Catholic countries, of heresy. In Protestant countries, of papal sympathy. The accusation changed, but the tone stayed the same. They serve a hidden master. The irony is that the hidden master was never a person. For Masons, the unseen presence they honor is simply the idea of order, what they call the great architect of the universe. It isn't a god of dogma, but a symbol of design, of meaning. The compass and square, their most famous emblems, are not tools of control, but reminders of proportion, balance, and self-restraint. A Mason's true temple, they say, is built within himself. It's a poetic philosophy, not a political one. But poetry is easily mistranslated when power listens. So, as Freemasonry spread through Europe and the New World, its double image solidified. Politicians saw it as influence, priests saw it as competition, ordinary citizens saw it as romance. It was the perfect screen for projection. Every age, from the Enlightenment to the Internet, painted its own fears and fantasies onto those same symbols. In the 18th century, when science challenged religion, Freemasonry looked like a new faith of reason. In the 19th, when revolutions shook monarchies, it looked like a revolutionary engine. In the 20th, when totalitarian regimes demanded total loyalty, it looked like a rival government of the mind. Even dictators who outlawed Freemasonry, Hitler, Franco, Stalin, never stopped fearing it. Because you can outlaw a club, but you can't outlaw the idea of independent thought. Inside the lodges, the truth was usually quieter. There were no plots to rule the world, only long speeches about virtue, morality, and the symbolism of light. The members argued about philosophy, ethics, and the proper shape of the altar. The minutes of those meetings survive in archives, written in the dull language of bureaucracy. No secret world order, just committees, dues, and dinner menus. But even if the reality was mundane, the perception carried power. Every time the public imagined something vast and invisible behind the lodge doors, it gave the Masons a kind of mythic aura. And myth, once born, no longer belongs to those who inspired it. It belongs to everyone who believes it. That's why the idea of Freemasonry continues to divide people even today. For some, it represents enlightenment, a lineage of knowledge passed from ancient builders to modern thinkers. For others, it represents manipulation, a hidden elite that moves unseen through politics and finance. Both views are wrong in part, but both contain a shadow of truth. Because Freemasonry does connect people. It does open doors, sometimes powerful ones. And where doors open quietly, suspicion follows loudly. So, when people ask, what do the Masons really do? The answer depends on who's asking. To a historian, they are a cultural phenomenon of the Enlightenment, part club, part ritual, part social network. To a believer, they are guardians of ancient wisdom. To a critic, they are the architects of hidden power. And to the Masons themselves, they are simply brothers building a better version of themselves. The confusion between these images, harmless fraternity and global cabal, is not accidental. It's the price of secrecy in a transparent age. Where facts are silent, imagination speaks. And once imagination begins to speak, it rarely whispers. So before we follow the story deeper, before we walk through the temples of myth and the archives of history, it's worth remembering this. The legend of Freemasonry may not reveal much about the Masons themselves, but it reveals everything about our need to find meaning in mystery. When people speak about Freemasonry, they often begin not with history, but with legend. And that, in itself, is telling. Because long before the first lodge ever opened its doors, there were stories. Vast, beautiful, improbable stories about where it all began. They tell us less about the past than about the human need to believe that meaning is ancient. According to one Masonic tradition, the craft began with Adam himself. The first man, they say, was also the first builder. He shaped the world's first dwelling, the humble shelter of Eden after exile. When his son Cain built a city, he followed the same divine geometry. In this mythic lineage, construction becomes sacred, the act by which humanity restores the harmony it lost. And thus, the Mason is not just a worker, but a restorer of paradise. Another legend links the brotherhood to Noah. In that version, the ark is not merely a vessel of survival, but a temple of proportion, built by divine instruction. The flood becomes the first purification, and Noah's sons the first keepers of secret measurements. Each generation, they say, carried fragments of this sacred geometry forward, a code of lines, angles, and ratios that preserved not only structure, but wisdom. But the most famous story begins in Jerusalem, at the building of Solomon's Temple. It is here that Freemasonry's mythology finds its central figure, Hiram Abiff, the master architect. In Masonic ritual, Hiram is both builder and martyr, a man entrusted with the sacred design who refused to betray his secret methods and died for that loyalty. His death and symbolic resurrection form the moral core of Masonic initiation, fidelity to principle, even in the face of destruction. For centuries, Masons have reenacted that story in their lodges, not as theater, but as meditation on integrity and rebirth. To outsiders, this can seem cryptic, but it is no stranger than any religious parable. Just as Christians reenact the Passion, or alchemists spoke of death and transmutation, Masons use Hiram's story to dramatize an inner transformation, the building of a moral self. Of course, none of this is historical. Archaeologists have found no evidence of guilds descending directly from the temple builders of Jerusalem. But that misses the point. The legend was never meant as fact. It was a way of granting purpose to a profession that worked with hands, yet dreamed with mind. By linking their craft to biblical architecture, medieval builders could see their labor as part of divine history. They were not just stacking stones, they were continuing creation. This blending of myth and geometry fascinated thinkers of the Enlightenment. Men like Isaac Newton, himself deeply interested in alchemy, prophecy, and sacred proportion, saw in architecture a reflection of cosmic law. For Newton, geometry was not only a branch of mathematics, it was the handwriting of God. Every line drawn by compass, every perfect square, mirrored the harmony of creation. That language of number and proportion felt timeless, even spiritual. And Freemasonry, with its symbols of compasses and pillars, became a vessel for that idea. In their myths, the builders of cathedrals became heirs to the builders of the cosmos. To shape stone was to imitate the divine architect. To work together in harmony was to restore the balance of heaven on earth. It was both practical and poetic, and that combination gave it enduring power. As Freemasonry evolved from real stonemasons to speculative masons, men who built not with stone but with philosophy, these stories gained new layers of meaning. Adam, Noah, and Hiram became symbols of stages in the human journey: innocence, purification, enlightenment. Each represented an aspect of creation and fall, destruction and reconstruction. In their retellings, the world itself became a temple under construction. The myth also offered something more subtle: universality. Because by tracing their origin to the dawn of humanity, the Masons could stand above national or religious division. If Adam was the first Mason, then all men were brothers by birth. If Hiram's temple predated church and state, then morality could exist beyond doctrine. That sense of universal brotherhood, grounded in allegory rather than theology, would later make Freemasonry both appealing to philosophers and suspicious to priests. What makes these legends so enduring is that they blend the physical and the spiritual. They suggest that the same principles that govern a well-built wall, balance, order, proportion, also govern a well-built soul. A crooked beam can make a house collapse. A crooked intention can make a life collapse. To work true is not just to lay stones straight, but to live honestly. That language of metaphor became the foundation of Masonic philosophy. Even today, initiation ceremonies are filled with architectural imagery: the cornerstone of virtue, the pillars of wisdom, the light of understanding entering the dark chamber of ignorance. Each phrase turns construction into contemplation. Each tool, the level, the trowel, the compass, becomes a moral symbol. It is a theology of craftsmanship. For modern ears, this may sound strange, even mystical, but for people of earlier centuries, it made perfect sense. They lived in a world where the boundary between science and spirituality was porous. Alchemy, astronomy, and geometry all spoke of divine design. To understand nature was to approach God. And Freemasonry, with its emphasis on order and light, fit neatly into that worldview. It's easy, from a modern perspective, to dismiss such legends as romantic inventions. But myths have their own truth. They tell us what people needed to believe. And in the case of the Masons, what they needed to believe was that human hands could participate in divine creation, that every measurement, every stone, every act of precision was a small echo of cosmic harmony. That is why the old Masonic phrase still resonates: "We build not cathedrals, but men." Behind its simplicity lies the oldest human dream: to make meaning with our hands, to turn labor into light. To move from myth to history, we have to leave the temples of legend and step into the real cathedrals of stone. If Freemasonry's stories begin with Adam and Solomon, its true birth belongs to medieval Europe, to the centuries when men built with their hands what faith imagined in heaven. The Middle Ages were an age of stone. Across Europe, from England to Bohemia, spires rose like frozen prayers. Every village had a church. Every city dreamed of a cathedral that could reach God. To build them required generations, not years, but lifetimes. A mason might start a wall that his grandson would finish. Their work was a collaboration between art and endurance. Those builders formed guilds, groups that preserved their trade secrets, trained apprentices, and protected the quality of their craft. In an age without universities for artisans, the guild was both school and sanctuary. Its knowledge was practical: how to mix lime, measure angles, carve stone. But it was also moral. Each apprentice swore an oath of honesty, loyalty, and respect for the tools. To betray a secret of the craft was not just to risk the guild's trust, it was to insult the art itself. Because cathedrals were built by many, order mattered. The hierarchy was clear: apprentices, journeymen, masters. Each level brought new privileges and responsibilities. Initiations existed too, ceremonies where a new craftsman was symbolically welcomed into the brotherhood of builders. They weren't mystical rituals, but they carried meaning. A candle might be lit, an oath sworn, a handshake exchanged. These were gestures of trust, of belonging. Centuries later, those same gestures would reappear in Masonic lodges, transformed from professional custom into moral symbolism. The medieval Mason's life was a blend of freedom and discipline. Unlike peasants, they traveled, following construction projects across regions, carrying letters of recommendation known as marks. Their tools were their passports, their reputation was their currency. When they arrived at a new site, they presented their mark, showed their skill, and were admitted into the lodge, the temporary hut or building near the cathedral where Masons gathered to rest, plan, and share knowledge. That lodge was literal, not metaphorical. It smelled of stone dust and wood shavings, not incense and candles. Yet even in these dusty workshops, a sense of mystery grew. Ordinary people rarely saw inside them, and the builders, proud of their craft, guarded their designs closely. To outsiders, the geometry of cathedrals seemed magical. How did these men, with no books and no noble titles, create such perfection of line and light? Their mastery looked like alchemy. And so the Masons became figures of quiet awe, working men who touched the divine through skill. The decline of the Middle Ages brought change. By the 15th and 16th centuries, cathedral building slowed. Renaissance architects replaced guild masters. Geometry moved from hand to paper. The practical lodges began to vanish. But the idea of fraternity, of men bound by craft and moral code, did not vanish. It lingered in memory, preserved in old manuscripts and oral traditions. In Scotland and England, a few lodges survived, as social groups, meeting not to carve stone, but to preserve the camaraderie and ceremony of their predecessors. Gradually, these lodges began admitting members who were not builders at all. They were scholars, landowners, and gentlemen fascinated by symbolism, geometry, and moral philosophy. They called themselves accepted or speculative Masons, speculative because they no longer worked with materials, but with ideas. They saw in the old guild's language a perfect metaphor for their own era, the Enlightenment. Building, after all, was a form of reason, shaping chaos into structure, just as philosophy tried to shape ignorance into knowledge. This shift from operative to speculative Masonry was quiet, almost accidental. No single event marked the change. It happened naturally, as traditions adapted to survive. By the early 17th century, many lodges contained both craftsmen and philosophers. Their conversations ranged from architecture to astronomy, from scripture to morality. They began to see themselves as builders of a different kind of temple, a symbolic one, built not of stone, but of virtue. The last true link to the old guilds disappeared as the industrial age approached, but their language, their oaths, and their sense of hierarchy remained. The Masonic titles of apprentice, fellowcraft, and master are direct descendants of those medieval ranks. Even the tools, the square, the level, the plumb line, carried over unchanged. Only their meanings expanded. They became metaphors for fairness, balance, and rectitude. It's worth pausing here, because this is where myth and history finally meet. Freemasonry's medieval roots explain both its secrecy and its structure. The secrecy was once practical, to protect professional knowledge and economic security. The structure was functional, to organize labor and reward skill. But when the stonework ended, both secrecy and structure found a new purpose. They became moral and philosophical. The physical craft turned into a spiritual one. This transformation, from building cathedrals to building character, is what made Freemasonry something unique. It bridged two worlds, the tactile and the intellectual. It allowed scholars to imagine themselves as craftsmen of the soul, and craftsmen to imagine themselves as philosophers of stone. In that meeting of hand and mind, something quietly revolutionary was born. By the 17th century, Europe was changing. Science was replacing superstition. Nation-states were replacing feudal bonds. But amid that change, people still longed for continuity, for rituals that connected them to something ancient, orderly, and meaningful. Freemasonry offered exactly that. It took the humility of labor and turned it into a philosophy of life. The cathedrals still stand, centuries of weight held by arches and vaults so precise they seem effortless. They remind us that the true secret of the Masons was never mystical. It was patience, cooperation, and faith in proportion. And those qualities, once spiritualized, became the foundation of an idea that would travel far beyond the stone yard, an idea that would soon call itself the Great Lodge. History, unlike legend, always begins in a specific place and moment. For Freemasonry, that moment came on a summer day in London, June 24, 1717. It was St. John's Day, a traditional festival of light and renewal. In a small tavern called the Goose and Gridiron, 4 local lodges met to form what they called the Grand Lodge of England. It was an ordinary meeting, yet it marked the beginning of something that would soon span continents. At first, there was nothing grand about it. A handful of men gathered in a smoky room above a pub, drank ale, and voted on a few rules. But their ambition was quiet and radical: to unite scattered lodges under a single structure and to turn an old craft guild into a new moral fraternity. They were tired of superstition and sectarian conflict. Europe was just emerging from centuries of religious wars. What they wanted was a brotherhood that rose above creed, one that valued reason, tolerance, and virtue. That idea, simple as it was, became the seed of modern Freemasonry. The new Grand Lodge didn't build cathedrals, it built constitutions. In 1723, a Scottish Presbyterian minister named James Anderson published the Constitutions of the Freemasons. It combined myth, history, and philosophy into a single charter. The opening pages read like scripture rewritten for the age of reason. A Mason is obliged by his tenure to obey the moral law. He will never be a stupid atheist nor an irreligious libertine. It was less a rule book than a manifesto for a new kind of enlightenment, one rooted in morality, not dogma. Anderson's constitutions reimagined the ancient builders as philosophers of virtue. Every tool became a symbol, every action a moral lesson. The square taught fairness, the level equality, the compass restraint. The lodge was no longer a workshop, but a microcosm of harmony, a place where men of every faith could meet as equals under the metaphorical eye of the great architect of the universe. That phrase, so carefully chosen, allowed believers of any religion to participate without conflict. It was inclusive, but also discreet. It named the divine without defining it. In that sense, early Freemasonry was not rebellion against religion, but its refinement. It kept the structure of ritual and the language of faith, but replaced doctrine with ethics. Where churches divided people by belief, lodges united them by principle. That quiet universality gave Freemasonry its unique appeal. It felt ancient, yet modern, mystical, yet rational. It allowed men to feel spiritual without being bound by church authority, a delicate balance that would both inspire and alarm the centuries that followed. The 18th century was a fertile ground for such ideas. London at that time was the capital of conversation. Coffee houses buzzed with debates about philosophy, science, and politics. Newspapers were spreading faster than sermons. Society was beginning to believe that knowledge could replace lineage and reason could replace revelation. Freemasonry fit perfectly into this new landscape. It offered ritual without superstition, equality without anarchy, and fellowship without fanaticism. Membership grew rapidly. Lodges opened across Britain, then on the continent. Each carried the same symbols, but adapted to local culture. In France, Freemasonry took on a more philosophical and political tone. In Germany, it leaned toward mysticism and moral introspection. In Scotland, it preserved older operative customs. And in America, it merged with the ideals of independence and self-governance. The same compass and square that once lay on the builder's table now appeared on flags, coins, and revolutionary manifestos. It's easy, looking back, to see why the idea spread so quickly. Freemasonry offered something that both monarchs and commoners lacked: community without hierarchy. Inside a lodge, a prince and a merchant were equals. They addressed each other as brother. That simple word had quiet power. It crossed class, nationality, and faith. It embodied the Enlightenment dream of a world guided by merit rather than birth. Still, not everyone trusted it. Secrecy, even when innocent, breeds suspicion. The Catholic Church condemned Freemasonry as early as 1738, accusing it of heresy and moral relativism. Pope saw in it a rival faith, one that placed conscience above obedience. Governments, too, grew wary. An organization that united citizens across borders, met behind closed doors, and swore oaths of loyalty to one another was bound to alarm those in power. To the authorities, brotherhood could look dangerously like conspiracy. Inside the lodges, the members saw themselves differently. They believed they were building not empires, but character. The tools of their meetings, the aprons, the columns, the symbols of light and darkness, were reminders of moral discipline. Each degree of initiation marked progress in self-understanding. To become a master mason was not to gain secret power, but to accept responsibility. To be square in conduct, level in judgment, and true in action. That language of moral geometry may sound archaic, but it carried profound psychological weight. In a time when identity was tied to birth and class, the lodge offered an alternative identity, one earned through behavior, not inheritance. It allowed men to reconstruct themselves as moral beings, just as the old builders had reconstructed stones. To join the lodge was to begin building inwardly what cathedrals had once expressed outwardly: order, proportion, and light. When historians look for the reason Freemasonry survived so long, they often miss this simple truth. It endured not because of secrecy, but because of symbolism. Symbols never age, they only change meaning. And Freemasonry, by anchoring itself in the language of symbols, could evolve with every generation, without losing its soul. The Goose and Gridiron Tavern is long gone. The men who gathered there never imagined that their small fraternity would become the subject of novels, revolutions, and centuries of rumor. They simply wanted a space where morality could be practiced like a craft, measured, shaped, improved. In doing so, they accidentally created the most enduring secret society of the modern age. Once the Great Lodge of England established its pattern, Freemasonry began to move, not by decree, but by invitation. Ideas travel faster than armies, and the language of brotherhood proved irresistible to a Europe ready for something new. Within a few decades, lodges appeared in France, the Netherlands, Germany, Italy, and Russia. Everywhere they went, they absorbed local habits and anxieties, taking on the flavor of the culture that adopted them. Freemasonry was not a religion or a philosophy, it was a framework. And frameworks can hold very different kinds of meaning. France was the first to make it fashionable. There, Freemasonry became an ornament of refinement, a mark of intellect and social grace. Parisian salons embraced it eagerly. Writers, nobles, and scientists joined side by side. Voltaire himself, the great skeptic of dogma, was initiated late in life, surrounded by candlelight and applause. In the hands of the French, the lodge became a place of wit and discussion, less solemn than the English version, more theatrical, more self-aware. Ritual blended with philosophy, and soon the movement developed a distinctly French character, elegant, speculative, and quietly political. From France, the craft spread eastward. In the German states, Freemasonry took a different turn, inward, mystical, and serious. The German Enlightenment had always leaned toward introspection. Its thinkers sought harmony not in reason alone, but in the balance between reason and faith. Here, Masonic lodges became schools of moral philosophy, where discussions about virtue mingled with meditation and mysticism. They adopted new degrees, added elaborate allegories, and introduced an emotional intensity unknown in England. Their members read Jacob Boehme and Paracelsus, debated alchemy and Kabbalah, and began to see in the Masonic Temple a symbol of the human soul itself. In this climate, Freemasonry became almost a religion of enlightenment, a bridge between science and spirituality. It was also in Germany that a new branch was born, the so-called strict observance, founded in the mid-18th century. Its leader, Baron Karl von Hund, claimed that Freemasonry was a continuation of the Knights Templar, the medieval order dissolved by the Church centuries earlier. He said that mysterious, unknown superiors guided the lodges from the shadows, keeping alive the secret wisdom of the Templars. The story was intoxicating. It added romance to ritual, conspiracy to fraternity. Within years, thousands joined this Templar version of Masonry, eager to feel part of a hidden chivalric tradition. No documents ever proved von Hundt's claims, but the myth stuck. The image of Freemasons as successors to the Templars became one of the most persistent legends in Western imagination. It added swords and secrecy to what had once been only compasses and squares. For some, it elevated Masonry into a spiritual knighthood. For others, it turned it into a shadow government. Both impressions would echo for centuries. While Germany dreamed of mystic origins, France continued to multiply new rites, systems of degrees that elaborated on the simple English model. One lodge might offer 3 degrees, another 7, a third 33. Each degree added symbols, ceremonies, and lessons. Some drew from Egyptian mythology, others from alchemy, Christian mysticism, or even astrology. The result was a rich but confusing tapestry, part spiritual drama, part moral education, part social theater. Historians later compared these rites to the encyclopedias of the Enlightenment, attempts to organize all human knowledge under one symbolic roof. The flexibility of Freemasonry was both its strength and its curse. Because the movement had no central dogma, each country could interpret it freely. In Protestant regions, it leaned toward rational ethics. In Catholic ones, toward esoteric mysticism. In monarchies, it could look loyalist. In republics, revolutionary. Everywhere, it adapted, a mirror that reflected the desires of those who looked into it. By the middle of the 18th century, Masonic lodges had become meeting points for thinkers and reformers. They offered privacy in an age of censorship, civility in an age of conflict. Writers discussed politics without fear of denunciation. Scientists exchanged ideas across borders. For a brief moment, the lodge felt like a model of an ideal society, one governed not by lineage or religion, but by merit and reason. It was, in miniature, the Enlightenment made tangible. This idealism did not go unnoticed by governments. Authorities began to see in the lodges the potential for unrest. The same networks that spread philosophical debate could also spread dissent. By the 1770s, whispers linked the Masons to revolutions, not entirely without cause. Some American founding fathers, including George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, were indeed Masons. So, were many French officers who supported the American cause. Their use of symbols, light, liberty, equality, sounded suspiciously similar to Masonic vocabulary. The overlap fed the myth that behind every call for freedom stood the lodge. In truth, Freemasonry did not start revolutions, but it offered a language through which revolutionaries could speak, a language of initiation, equality, and moral rebirth. The idea that society could be rebuilt as a temple of reason came directly from Masonic allegory. It is no coincidence that revolutionary France replaced churches with temples of reason, or that new republics adopted the language of light overcoming darkness. Even when the lodges themselves remained apolitical, their metaphors escaped the walls. The movement spread to Russia brought another transformation. Catherine the Great, fascinated by Enlightenment ideas, yet wary of sedition, tolerated Masonic lodges for a time. Russian Freemasonry took on a spiritual and charitable character, publishing books, funding schools, and teaching moral discipline. But, as in the rest of Europe, suspicion followed. Whenever reform turned to rebellion, governments looked for invisible architects, and the Freemasons, with their secrecy and their symbols, fit the role perfectly. By the dawn of the 19th century, the fraternity had divided into countless rites and traditions, from the practical to the mystical. There were lodges that focused on charity, others on alchemy, others on politics. Some sought light, others sought influence. And from that diversity grew contradiction, the fertile ground where both admiration and fear would bloom. Looking back, it's clear that Freemasonry spread not by force, but by resonance. It offered people a structure through which to express the deepest human longings, to belong, to improve, to understand the hidden order behind the visible world. Wherever people felt confined by dogma or hierarchy, the lodge offered space, and where people fear hidden power, that same space looked suspicious. The paradox had returned, now on a global scale. The more Freemasonry preached equality and enlightenment, the more it was accused of conspiracy and domination. And in that tension, between light and shadow, faith and doubt, the next chapters of its story would unfold. By the late 18th century, Freemasonry had become many things at once: a moral fraternity, a social network, a philosophical playground. But among its countless branches, one theme began to dominate: the search for inner illumination. Reason alone, people felt, could not satisfy the soul. After the Enlightenment's proud march of logic, there came a quieter hunger for mystery. And it was in that space, between science and faith, that the mystics entered the lodge. Europe at the time was full of half-forgotten spiritual traditions. Alchemy had lost its practical meaning, but not its symbolism. Kabbalah and Christian mysticism had blended into the new language of theosophy. Everywhere, thinkers sought to unite the material and the divine, to read the universe as a coded message from its creator. Freemasonry, with its architecture of symbols and rituals of transformation, became a perfect vessel for these ideas. Among the first to merge Masonry with mysticism was the enigmatic Frenchman Martinez de Pasquale. Born around 1727, he founded what he called the Order of the Élus Cohens, the elect priests. It combined Masonic structure with elaborate theurgical rites, prayers, symbols, and meditations meant to restore man's union with God. Pasquale taught that humanity had fallen from divine harmony and must rebuild its inner temple through ritual purification, a familiar Masonic metaphor, now given metaphysical weight. His disciples saw him as both master and magician, and his teachings spread through France like fire through paper. Among those disciples was a quiet, introspective man named Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin. He stripped away the ceremonial complexity of Pasquale's order and focused on the heart, on direct inner communion with the divine. For him, the true lodge was the human soul. The initiation was self-knowledge. He became known as the unknown philosopher, and his writings turned Freemasonry inward toward contemplation and moral introspection. St. Martin's ideas would later influence Romanticism and the mystical side of European thought, a reminder that not all revolutions happen in the streets. Some happen in silence. At the same time, in Germany, another current of mysticism flowed through the lodges. There, Freemasonry intersected with the writings of Jacob Boehme, a 17th-century shoemaker turned philosopher whose visions of divine light and darkness had inspired generations. Boehme described creation as an eternal struggle between order and chaos, between the fiery will and the gentle wisdom of God. His imagery resonated deeply with Masonic symbolism: light emerging from darkness, the temple built within, the dual pillars of balance. For many German Masons, Boehme's cosmology became a spiritual commentary on their own rituals. The influence of alchemy also persisted, though no longer in the literal search for gold. By the 1700s, alchemy had become a metaphor for transformation of the soul. To transmute lead into gold meant to refine base impulses into virtue, ignorance into understanding. The alchemist's furnace became the mason's temple. Both were spaces of purification. Even Isaac Newton, that model of scientific reason, had filled notebooks with alchemical speculation. His hidden studies reflected a truth that many Masons felt: that knowledge without mystery is incomplete. In this atmosphere, Freemasonry became a bridge between the rational and the spiritual. It allowed men of science to explore faith without surrendering reason, and men of faith to seek order without superstition. It was an architecture of reconciliation. Within the lodge, geometry and prayer coexisted comfortably. The compass measured both the heavens and the heart. But such synthesis always carries risk. When mystery enters structure, structure tends to multiply. By the 1770s, Masonic systems had become labyrinths of degrees, each promising deeper enlightenment. Some added ceremonies drawn from Egyptian myth, Osiris and Isis symbolizing death and rebirth. Others borrowed from Gnostic and Templar legends. To advance through the hierarchy, a Mason might undergo theatrical rituals, hear allegorical lectures, or receive secret words meant to awaken higher understanding. For some, it was spiritual drama. For others, self-importance disguised as revelation. Still, behind all these variations lay a shared belief that enlightenment was not only intellectual but moral. A Mason's true work was to polish the rough stone of his own nature until it reflected light clearly. In a world still ruled by inherited privilege, this idea that character, not birth, measured worth, felt revolutionary. It suggested that inner nobility could replace outer rank, that every man contained a spark of divine architecture. The mystics gave that idea emotional depth. They turned Freemasonry into a kind of spiritual workshop, where symbols were tools for self-transformation. The pillars became opposites within the self, mercy and severity, reason and passion, that had to be balanced. The temple represented not a building in Jerusalem, but the harmonious structure of the human spirit. Light was not knowledge alone, but awareness, the capacity to see both the visible and the invisible dimensions of life. It's easy, from our modern distance, to smile at these complexities, to see in them the romantic excesses of the 18th century. But to the people who lived through those times, they were attempts to reconcile two forces that had long been at war: faith and reason. The Church demanded obedience. Science demanded skepticism. Freemasonry, in its mystical branches, tried to harmonize them, to teach that truth could be both rational and sacred. Of course, such openness invited both genius and delusion. Where some saw revelation, others saw opportunity. The line between mystic and charlatan would soon blur, and figures claiming secret powers would exploit the language of Masonry for personal gain. They would promise initiation not into morality, but into magic. And their theatrics, seductive, absurd, sometimes dangerous, would eventually stain the reputation of Freemasonry itself. But before that decline, there was a moment of genuine beauty, when rational men spoke the language of light without irony, and when symbols carried faith instead of fear. It was a fleeting harmony, fragile but sincere, the belief that inside every person lies a spark of divine geometry, waiting to be uncovered by the patient hands of conscience. To understand Freemasonry not as rumor, but as lived experience, we must step quietly inside the lodge itself, not the mythical Temple of Solomon or the conspiratorial chamber of imagination, but a real meeting room, somewhere in an ordinary town. The air smells faintly of wax and paper. The light is warm, never harsh. Around the room stand chairs, columns, and simple symbols drawn in chalk or laid out in wood and metal. It feels less like a fortress of secrets than a carefully arranged classroom. Before a meeting begins, brothers gather informally, shaking hands, exchanging news, joking softly. For all its reputation of solemnity, Freemasonry has always been social. It binds men who might otherwise never meet: shopkeepers, judges, teachers, clerks, generals. Inside the lodge, titles are left at the door. Everyone is equal, at least in principle. That equality is not political, it is moral. Each man is seen as a stone being shaped toward perfection, regardless of how rough he began. When the meeting starts, formality returns. The officers take their seats according to an order older than most nations. The master presides from the east, the direction of the rising sun, symbol of wisdom. To his right and left sit the wardens, representing strength and beauty. Their tools, the square, level, and plumb, rest before them as reminders of balance and uprightness. These objects, once practical, now carry quiet moral gravity. A craftsman once used them to build walls. A mason now uses them to measure his conduct. The ceremonies follow a rhythm of gestures and words that, to an outsider, might seem theatrical. But within the tradition, every motion has meaning. The initiation of a new member, for example, is not a test of secrecy, but a symbolic journey, from darkness into light, from ignorance into awareness. The candidate enters blindfolded, representing the state of unawakened mind. He is led around the room, stops before symbols, and hears lessons about truth, justice, and compassion. When the blindfold is finally removed, he sees light, not divine revelation, but understanding. It's a dramatized metaphor for the moment when learning replaces prejudice. There is no preaching in the lodge, no demand to believe in any specific faith. Instead, the lessons are delivered through parable and analogy. A hammer represents strength controlled by reason. A rough stone represents the self, needing to be smoothed through discipline and reflection. The lodge itself represents the world, structured, purposeful, and governed by moral geometry. Everything teaches without commanding. That is the distinctive character of Freemasonry. It never dictates what truth is, only how to seek it. Between ceremonies, the meetings are surprisingly practical. Brothers discuss charity work, elect officers, plan dinners, approve donations. In many lodges, the majority of time is spent not in ritual, but in administration. Minutes are read, votes are taken, and letters from other lodges are answered. It is more orderly than mystical, more communal than secretive. The secrecy, in fact, serves mostly as tradition, a way of creating intimacy, of preserving the sense that what happens in the lodge belongs to those present and no one else. Outside the formal meetings, there are gatherings that look almost ordinary. Shared meals, lectures, concerts, picnics. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Masonic banquets were famous for their humor and toasts. Each toast carried symbolic meaning, to wisdom, to virtue, to the brotherhood of man. There were songs, too, written by composers who were themselves Masons, Mozart, Haydn, and later Sibelius. Their melodies echoed the same themes of harmony and proportion that filled Masonic philosophy. The lodge was not a place of gloom, it was a workshop of fellowship. Yet even in these moments of joy, discipline remained. Every brother was expected to respect the boundaries of the order, to keep personal ambition outside, to guard discretion, and to remember that the real labor was inner. The Masonic apron, for example, was not a costume, but a reminder of humility. It symbolized the workman's duty, to serve, not to rule. In an age obsessed with rank and privilege, such modesty was radical. Each degree within the lodge carried deeper symbolism. The entered apprentice learned moral foundations, honesty, temperance, diligence. The fellowcraft studied the arts and sciences, seeking understanding of nature's order. The master mason faced the allegory of death and rebirth, the legend of Hiram Abiff, the faithful builder who dies rather than reveal sacred knowledge. Through these lessons, members were encouraged to meditate on mortality, loyalty, and the pursuit of virtue. The goal was not to gain power, but to refine conscience. To a historian, these rituals can seem elaborate. To participants, they are reminders. They preserve continuity in a world of change. A Mason in 1800 could walk into a lodge today and still recognize the language of symbols, the placement of columns, the quiet gravity of the proceedings. It is that sense of timelessness, of belonging to something that began before one's birth and will continue after one's death, that many members describe as the true secret of the craft. Of course, not every lodge lived up to its ideals. Like all human institutions, some became complacent, others political, still others absurdly self-important. But the essence survived. It was the idea that morality could be practiced through ritual, that fellowship could exist without hierarchy, and that learning could be sacred without being dogmatic. From the outside, these meetings might appear dull or mysterious. From within, they are closer to meditation, slow, repetitive, meaningful in proportion to one's attention. And that, perhaps, is the quiet genius of Freemasonry. It turns ordinary gestures into instruments of reflection. It makes every member both student and teacher, builder and building. When the meeting ends, the members rise, shake hands again, and leave in silence. Outside, the world resumes, noise, light, motion. But for a few hours within those walls, they have practiced a rare discipline, listening, remembering, and shaping themselves as patiently as their medieval ancestors once shaped stone. That is what remains when all the myths fall away, the simple, enduring act of building inwardly toward light. By the end of the 18th century, Freemasonry had become a symbol of the Enlightenment itself, cosmopolitan, rational, and idealistic. It promised a world where merit mattered more than birth, and truth was discovered through reason, not revelation. But the same qualities that made it appealing to philosophers made it alarming to those who ruled. Because in every age, institutions that claim universality look suspicious to powers that depend on division. The first wave of fear came from the Church. In 1738, Pope Clement XII issued a papal bull condemning Freemasonry, calling it a dangerous society that threatened both faith and order. His reasoning was simple. The lodges united men of all religions, which meant they placed conscience above doctrine. To a church built on authority, that was rebellion. Successive popes repeated the condemnation, warning that Freemasonry's secrecy concealed heresy. In truth, it concealed only independence. The ban did little to stop its growth. If anything, it made the lodges more attractive to thinkers and reformers. But it also marked the beginning of a long shadow, the idea that Freemasonry was not just different, but dangerous. Whenever governments faced unrest, they looked for invisible causes, and the lodges, private by nature, became convenient targets. The second wave of suspicion came not from religion, but from politics. As revolutionary ideas spread across Europe, Freemasonry was accused of being the secret architect behind them. The charge was not entirely fair, but not entirely false either. Many revolutionaries had indeed been Masons. The same values that inspired their meetings, liberty, equality, fraternity, also shaped the slogans of revolutions. But connection is not causation. Freemasonry had preached moral rebirth, not political revolt. Still, in times of fear, nuance vanishes. The Brotherhood of Light was recast as a brotherhood of subversion. The myth of a Masonic world conspiracy first took clear form in the 1790s. A French cleric named Abbé Baruel published a massive work blaming the French Revolution on three forces: philosophers, Protestants, and Freemasons. He claimed that they had plotted together to destroy the church and the monarchy. His story found eager readers among those who couldn't accept that revolution might arise from social injustice rather than secret design. Baruel's book turned anxiety into theology. For him, the chaos of the modern world had to have an author, and who better than men who met behind closed doors? Around the same time, in Bavaria, a real secret society appeared, the Order of the Illuminati, founded by the professor Adam Weishaupt. It was a small group dedicated to reason, education, and reform. But its secrecy, combined with its lofty ideals, made it the perfect raw material for myth. When Bavarian authorities suppressed it, rumors spread that it had simply gone underground, infiltrating lodges, governments, and armies. Soon, Freemasonry and the Illuminati became indistinguishable in the public imagination. The invisible hand had been born. From that moment on, the legend of Masonic conspiracy took on a life of its own. It crossed oceans and centuries, mutating with each era's fears. In America, preachers warned that the new republic was under Masonic control. In France, royalists claimed that the revolution had been scripted in lodges years earlier. In Russia, secret police files filled with speculation about foreign brotherhoods. Each story mirrored the same pattern, the belief that behind visible history stood hidden architects. The irony was sharp. Inside the lodges, members continued their quiet routines, electing officers, discussing charity, performing rituals about moral self-improvement. Their minutes from those years record debates about orphanages, education, and hospital funds. Yet outside, they were accused of summoning revolutions and rewriting history. The accusation was absurd, but also inevitable, because secrecy, even when innocent, always invites imagination. During the Napoleonic era, attitudes toward Freemasonry shifted again. Napoleon himself tolerated it, even encouraged it, seeing its structure as useful for governance. He filled the lodges with loyal officials, turning them from centers of independent thought into extensions of imperial order. For a time, the fraternity became fashionable once more, a polite ornament of power. But when empires fell, the suspicion returned. In the 19th century, as nationalism rose, Freemasonry became the perfect scapegoat for those who feared internationalism. To reactionary governments, it was a network of cosmopolitans undermining tradition. To conservative clergy, it was a rival faith of human reason. And to conspiracy theorists, it was the puppet master behind every liberal reform. Every political movement that needed an enemy found one in the lodges. The truth was much simpler. Freemasonry was never unified enough to control anything. By then, it had splintered into hundreds of rites and systems, some mystical, some charitable, some purely social. Its members ranged from revolutionaries to monarchists, from rationalists to mystics. The only thing they truly shared was ritual language and an ideal of moral improvement. But simplicity rarely satisfies fear. The idea of a hidden power is comforting precisely because it makes chaos feel intentional. If the world seems unpredictable, it is easier to believe that someone planned it. And so, generation after generation, the Masonic myth survived, not because of evidence, but because of need. Every new upheaval revived it. Every revolution, every crisis, every moment when society asked, "Who is to blame?" In truth, Freemasonry's role in history was neither demonic nor divine. It was reflective. It gathered the educated and the restless, gave them a language of virtue, and sometimes lent them courage to challenge stagnation. But it never dictated the outcome. Its lodges were laboratories of conversation, not engines of revolution. Yet from those conversations, new ideas about freedom and equality did emerge. And that, to those who preferred silence and obedience, was danger enough. By the turn of the 19th century, Freemasonry had become both admired and feared, a paradox it would never escape. Its symbols of light and balance had been interpreted as instruments of control. Its quiet rooms had been recast as command centers of global unrest. And though the men inside those rooms protested, history had already decided. Secrecy, once misunderstood, can never fully explain itself. By the dawn of the 20th century, Freemasonry had become both ordinary and legendary. Its temples stood openly in city centers, its charities sponsored hospitals and schools, and yet its name still whispered through every conspiracy. It existed simultaneously in two worlds, the visible and the imagined. To the historian, it was a civic fraternity. To the mythmaker, it was an invisible empire. The 19th century had already filled the air with suspicion. Revolutions, anti-clerical movements, and the birth of modern nationalism all found Freemasonry convenient to blame. But it was in the 20th century, the century of propaganda, that the myth reached its most dangerous form. When fear becomes an instrument of politics, secret societies make perfect enemies. In the 1920s and 1930s, authoritarian regimes across Europe turned Freemasonry into a target. Hitler's Germany, Mussolini's Italy, Franco's Spain, each banned lodges and seized their archives. The Nazis labeled Freemasonry a branch of Jewish international conspiracy, merging two separate prejudices into one ideology of hate. In their propaganda, the compass and square appeared beside the Star of David as proof of a single, hidden order corrupting nations. Thousands of Masons were imprisoned or killed under those accusations. Some died in concentration camps simply for belonging to a fraternity that valued tolerance. In those years, the Masonic idea of light became literally dangerous. The Soviet Union, on the opposite side of politics but similar in suspicion, also outlawed Freemasonry. To Marxist ideology, it represented bourgeois elitism and spiritual distraction. To the Church, it remained heresy. Thus, both the altar and the state agreed on one point, that men who met privately to discuss morality were untrustworthy. Freemasonry became a mirror reflecting every system's fear of independent thought. Yet even in persecution, the order survived. Its small lodges continued in exile or underground, keeping their rituals intact. After the Second World War, when the world rediscovered the words liberty and human rights, Freemasonry quietly reemerged as a symbol of civic virtue. In the United States, it had never truly disappeared. There, it was woven into public life. Presidents, inventors, soldiers, and judges counted themselves among its members. The lodges built hospitals, funded scholarships, and sponsored community service. For most Americans, Masonry was less about mystery than about mentorship. Its secrecy was tradition, not politics. But the myth proved harder to bury. In the 1950s and 60s, as television and pulp literature spread, Freemasonry became a ready-made symbol of intrigue. Writers and filmmakers needed conspiracies large enough to hold the world's attention, and the Masons, already famous for secrecy, were irresistible. The compass and all-seeing eye reappeared in detective novels, comic books, and thrillers. Each story exaggerated the same idea, that behind modern power lay ancient ritual. By the time the Da Vinci Code and similar works arrived decades later, the myth had become pop culture, stylized, cinematic, endlessly recycled. In truth, the reality of Freemasonry by then was almost mundane. Membership had peaked in the mid-20th century and was slowly declining. The lodges were aging. Their mysteries had become public through libraries and the internet. Anyone could read the rituals or decode the symbols. But paradoxically, the more transparent Masonry became, the stronger the myths grew. Transparency doesn't kill mystery, it feeds nostalgia for it. Why then do the old conspiracies survive? Partly because the structure of Freemasonry still resembles something people long for and fear at once, a network that crosses borders, unites elites, and speaks in symbols rather than slogans. In a fragmented world, that looks suspiciously like cohesion, and cohesion to the anxious feels like control. Every generation reuses the same image, a pyramid, an eye, a secret council shaping destiny. It satisfies the imagination's hunger for design and chaos. The irony is that such myths say less about the Masons than about the mind itself, a mind that mistrusts complexity and prefers a single hidden cause to 1,000 random ones. Meanwhile, within the lodges, the spirit that once animated great philosophers has quieted. The meetings still open with solemn ritual, but the debates are no longer about cosmic order or moral philosophy. They are about budgets, attendance, and community projects. In many places, Freemasonry has become what its critics always claimed it was, a social club for middle-aged men. And yet, the ideal behind it still flickers, that self-improvement and fraternity are sacred duties, that truth must be sought through reason and empathy. The simplicity of those ideas is easy to overlook, but it is what made the movement survive while empires fell. In the age of the Internet, Freemasonry's symbolism has entered a new afterlife. Memes, online videos, and endless forums have turned its imagery into shorthand for power itself. A pyramid on a dollar bill, an eye on a poster, a compass carved in stone, all are taken as clues to a single invisible design. Some of it is parody, some of it is faith. Modern conspiracy culture thrives on symbols that can mean anything, and the Masonic ones are perfect for that. It is the same instinct that makes prayer private, art personal, and friendship intimate. Mystery, when handled with humility, is not manipulation. It's protection, a shelter for meaning in a noisy world. Secrecy also creates focus. When an action is removed from the public gaze, it stops performing and starts becoming. Inside the lodge, men who might otherwise posture or compete are asked to reflect, to listen, to act deliberately. The very absence of spectators transforms the atmosphere. It invites sincerity, the kind of honesty that rarely survives in public life. The darkness before the ceremony is not ominous, it's concentration, a pause before illumination. That may be the true heart of Freemasonry, the belief that growth happens in silence. A builder works not by proclaiming, but by measuring, adjusting, aligning. Likewise, the moral architect works within, smoothing his own roughness before shaping the world around him. That inner labor, invisible and slow, is the opposite of the power usually attributed to secret societies. It is patient, not coercive. It builds rather than commands. There is, too, a paradox in how secrecy reveals character. Those who seek in Freemasonry the thrill of forbidden knowledge are often disappointed. There is no hidden formula, no world government. Only allegories repeated for centuries, urging decency and discipline. To endure such simplicity, to find meaning not in revelation but in repetition, requires a particular temperament. Freemasonry, at its best, attracts those who value process more than spectacle. That may be why its myths, though untrue, continue to fascinate. They promise what the real thing refuses to give: certainty. Because the truth about Masonry is the truth about life itself. It has no final secret, only continual interpretation. Its symbols are open to endless reading. A compass can mean geometry or morality. Light can mean reason or grace. Each generation remakes the symbols in its own image, projecting its hopes and fears onto them. In that sense, the Freemasons are not the keepers of some lost wisdom. They are mirrors, quiet, enduring, and patient enough to reflect whatever the world imagines. Perhaps that is why they survive when other orders fade. Their endurance lies not in the power to control events, but in the humility to accept misunderstanding. They do not rush to correct myths, they simply continue their work, trusting that the slow architecture of virtue matters more than public approval. It is a strange kind of faith, the faith that even in misunderstanding, something valuable can endure. In the end, the fascination with secret societies says less about them than about us. We live surrounded by complexity and randomness, yet we long to believe that someone understands the pattern. Conspiracy theories offer comfort. They replace chaos with intention. But perhaps what really frightens us is not hidden control, but hidden indifference. The idea that no one is guiding anything. Against that fear, the image of an ancient brotherhood working quietly toward order feels reassuring. We invent the secret architect because we cannot bear the thought that the world builds itself by accident. And maybe that's the final irony. For all the suspicion it attracts, Freemasonry's deepest lesson has always been about transparency, the inner kind. It teaches that no matter how much darkness surrounds us, we can build light within. That every person is both architect and material, builder and stone. That truth is not revealed from above, but constructed through patience, honesty, and proportion. If that sounds simple, it is. And yet, simplicity is the hardest secret to keep, especially in an age that prefers noise to stillness. Perhaps that's why the myths never fade. They fill the silence left by modest truth. So, after centuries of speculation, what remains? Not hidden rulers, not forbidden formulas, just a few enduring gestures. A handshake of trust, a candle lit in reflection, a promise to build one's life with integrity. Small, human acts that somehow survived wars, revolutions, and the age of information. That may be the real mystery of Freemasonry, not that it hides power, but that it still believes in gentleness. And maybe that's enough, because in the end, every generation needs at least one story that reminds it of light, even if the light is only a symbol and the temple only the heart.